the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, voiced by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Destination Mecca by Idries Shah. This audio has been made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Chapter 7. Red Sea Journey. Ours was not a pilgrim ship, not at any rate at first. Suez seemed as Suez so often is, hot and dusty, built on a kind of slope, as punishing to the feet as the taximen's demands are to the purse. Stamped deeply in its shops as well as by its street signs with the unmistakable presence of the British Army, it felt somehow uneasy, brooding. I was now a pilgrim, heading southwards through the Canal and the Red Sea, bound for Jeddah, the pilgrim port of Saudi Arabia. When he saw my visa, the passport officer shrugged to his colleague of the customs. Hujjaj, or pilgrims, it seemed from his remarks, never had anything much dutiable. Andu mafish haga. He hasn't got anything. I wondered, as I always do, why there should be so much preoccupation about people leaving the country. I had paid, quite generously I thought, for the privilege of having my baggage examined upon entering. But there it was, and the usual procedure would have to be followed. It is difficult to say whether this ritual is naive, kindly, or even lax, but the fact that I had seen about 20 of my future travelling companions go through it meant that I was prepared. Thus, when the customs man fixed me with a penetrating gaze, I was not surprised to hear the exultant "ha-ha" of his fellow, strategically stationed directly behind me, and calculated, it seemed, to cause the intending smuggler immediately to leap out of his skin with fear and confess all. Having survived this, I walked up the gangplank into a smallish vessel, clean enough but somehow too all-metal for this broiling sun. When we got under way, I was to think of this, to reflect that if I felt discomfort at the unyielding character of a steel ship, how much more aching must have been the regret of those used to the generous movement of wooden walls, with the white canvas billowing out above. Both the captain and the inevitably red-haired engineer were Scots. Most of the crew hailed from the valley of the Nile. The passengers seemed to be of every nation except Egypt. As we started, the call to midday prayer sounded from the third class and steerage, where the patient pilgrims sat. A Turkoman in felt boots, he had walked almost all the way from Persia, stood leading the worshippers facing Meccawards. Only 3 so far were dressed in pilgrim white: Ahmed the Somali, his wife, and their 6-year-old son Abdullah. On our own deck, the Saudi sheikh, the Syrian agronomist, and 2 Turkish journalists had already made friends. An American, bound for Aden, read Sherlock Holmes and called for tea every half hour. The incessant blurred rhythm of Arabic music haunted every corner of the deck. Loudspeakers carried the Cairo radio programs from dawn to dusk. As we negotiated the chain of connected lakes which make up the canal, 2 days' steaming brought about a complete change of mood aboard the ship. It was as if we were in another world. Everything of Cairo had been forgotten. There were no smells, no teeming hordes of curious and idle lingerers, nothing but the throb of the engines and the white birds circling overhead. We were but 4 days from Jeddah now, from the land to sea, which some of us had walked for years, others saved all their lives. The first unusual event was the complete abandoning of all distinctions between first and third class passengers. Though they spent most of their time in their own part of the ship, all passengers mixed freely and made one another welcome. One, more pious perhaps than others, prevailed upon the radio officer to disconnect the relaying of music. Under awnings the faithful sat, prayed, or read books. The westernized first-class travelers now paced the deck in flowing robes. The Syrian still watered his plants 5 times a day, and he was growing a beard. I, too, stopped shaving, because it would have been discourteous to appear before the king clean-shaven. If I was to see the king, that was. The American complained that the puritanical Saudi sheikh had thrown all playing cards overboard as inventions of the devil. One might almost have said, if this were not a phrase with completely irrelevant associations, that we were reverting to type. This was the transition period. The women passengers formed a group of their own, under the presidency of the wife of one of the clerics of the Mecca sanctuary, who was returning from a visit to her sister in Cairo. She coached them in the recitations and prayers to be used during the pilgrimage, and spoke of the work that she was doing in social welfare and for the benefit of children in the Hejaz. I seemed to be the person with the best grasp of English, and the American attached himself to me. He questioned me rather narrowly as to the motives for my journey, what I expected to get out of it, and the conditions of life in Saudi Arabia. Even in his case, I maintained my policy of secrecy about the intention to photograph the shrine, just in case. There are a lot of Americans employed by the Saudi government in the less restricted parts of the country. Eventually, the American asked me to take him to Mecca. He would be allowed, he said, to land at Jeddah. This was not a forbidden city. Once there, it would be possible, though not easy, to get into Mecca. He was willing to pay all expenses. He was willing even to reimburse me for my trouble. But I had troubles enough, and I told him that I would like to do it, but that being on the pilgrimage, I could not be a party to such a deception. Was he a Muslim? He was not. In that case, you would not get much benefit out of going to Mecca. But he wanted to be the first American to go there. After all, Mecca was more impenetrable than Tibet. He knew. He'd been to Tibet. Nothing to it, he told me. If he became a Muslim, would he be able to get in? I told him it was possible, but it would take time and perseverance. It might take years before he was sufficiently trusted. Even then, a false move could mean death. It has happened before. I reminded him that times were even more difficult than when such men as Burton got through in disguise. Today you have to run the gauntlet of walkie-talkie apparatus, identity cards and pilgrim passports, plus having to know the rituals and ways of Islam. Suspense, suppressed excitement, the feeling of a profound experience soon to come throbbed in every pilgrim heart as we neared Jeddah. Then, in the brilliant hardness of the early morning sunlight, Saudi Arabia was sighted. For the first time, as the white-robed faithful lined the rails, I heard the immemorial pilgrim chant that was to be repeated 1,000 times during my stay there. Labbaik, Allahumma labbaik. We are here, O Lord, we are here. Gleaming whitely, coral built beyond those treacherous reefs through which ships could not pass to her quaysides, Jeddah beckoned, and Mecca, only 50 miles eastward through the desert. Amid the cheers of the crew and chanting of the first chapter of the Quran, we got into small boats and were ferried to the jetties where annually upwards of 100,000 Muslims land, from Morocco, Java, and almost every eastern land. Even before we reached the shore, striking evidence of the contrast in a changing east abounded. Perched within the harbour on coral outcrops, fishermen were angling for the food which makes up so much of the diet of Jeddah's poorer citizens. Large hoardings inscribed in Arabic, Indonesian, and half a dozen other tongues proclaimed, "Pilgrims, Saudi Arabia welcomes you." Bronzed and hefty porters, their girdled costumes unchanged since Abraham's day, unloaded a Pakistani ship to the strains of the traditional, haunting shanty of their trade. Stacked in immense heaps, merchandise from all the world lay awaiting customs examination in the huge concrete buildings so new that the roofs were actually being put on while they were in active use. This was just a symptom of the age of plenty which multi-million American oil royalties have brought to Arabia today. The Turkoman was already in tears as we landed, and spoke of the sand getting in his eyes as we shook hands in farewell. Before Ibn Saud conquered this country, the peninsula was divided into the austere northern part, Nejd, and this, the southern, easygoing Hejaz. Even today, 30 years later, the king keeps his capital in Riyadh, towards the Persian Gulf, and foreign embassies accredited to Saudi Arabia must remain in Jeddah, dotted in their graceful mansions around the curving inland bay. Each group of pilgrims went to the arched hall of pilgrim reception for refreshment, identification, and allocation of guides. I put my bags on the customs bench and opened them. My camera was slung around my neck, looking very much like one of those leather Quran cases which many religious people carry. I had not expected any special treatment, but as soon as I presented my passport, a gorgeously robed sheikh of the Administration of Hospitality took charge of me. I was ushered into a modern American car and driven rapidly through the dazzling ultra-modern streets to the Diafa, guest apartments of the king. Entering the thickly carpeted, cool vastness of the hall of reception, I felt some diffidence in giving my name to the manager. This white-robed figure, with the twin camel hair circlets of the Bedouin on his head, I felt might harbour some antagonism towards descendants of the Prophet, on political grounds. I knew that Ibn Saud would not permit any privileged class, and expected some sort of reaction. However this may once have been, it is no longer the case. I was announced to the assembled gathering with many a high-flown title. Grave, bearded faces courteously composed, they rose, and we kissed each other's hands. When I got to the middle of the horseshoe of armchairs, a giant, red-bearded elder noticed my hesitation. I am the doctor in charge of the quarantine, he told me, with an Edinburgh lilt to his excellent Arabic. Like all foreigners in Saudi Arabia, he wore the white robe and brown Bedouin cloak woven from the hair of the Kuwait camel. I was later to meet several such men, engineers, doctors, scientists, from Britain, America, Czechoslovakia or France, Saudi officials now, and remarkably confident in their adopted characters of what are locally called Musta'arabin, Arabized ones, just as Robert of Chester and Michael Scott were known as Musta'arabi in the Moorish Spain of an earlier age. Upon reflection, it is hard to say why one should at first feel this change to be so odd. Why should it be taken for granted that an Arab may live in Britain as the British do, yet the reverse appears so unusual or difficult? I sent a telegram by radio to the king at Riyadh, announcing my arrival and stating that I was ready to fly to the capital to render him homage after performing my essential pilgrimage duties in the Holy City. The new post office building where I sent this message was an eye-opener. Today's Arab buildings in Jeddah are built in a blending of the ancient and Western styles, and equipped with what seems a complete disregard for expense. Faisal Street, named after the Viceroy of the Hejaz, runs through the centre of the new town, right up to the docks. And this, at the other end of the city, joins the Pilgrim Way, the newly macadammed road leading to Mecca itself. Dominated on both sides by immense steel and concrete structures, apartment houses, banks, and administrative buildings, fish-tailed Cadillacs purr through its sweeping length. You will not find many places like Jeddah in the Middle East. Yet, in spite of an almost bewildering array of Western products and machines, Jeddah still holds much of that indefinable quality which we cannot analyze, and even today must call the magic of the East. Dressed in my one-piece, unstitched robe of cotton, with sandaled feet, with bare head in a temperature of 113 degrees, I wandered farther afield. This is the obligatory garb of all who come to make the pilgrimage. None must wear silk or anything that would show social distinctions. The town's cosmopolitan cafes, although they serve Western soft drinks as well as the harsh Nejdi coffee, do not cater for any superficially westernized clientele. Although the fierce-eyed, armed-to-the-teeth Bedouin from the desert does stand out in contrast with his more sophisticated urban compatriot, yet for all this, both the well-trained Arab radio engineer or oil technician and the tribesman from the wilds continue to conform to age-old tradition, the code which increasing prosperity only seems to make more binding. This is probably because the royal family set the fashion. This historic headcloth, bound with interlinked ropes, and a voluminous camel hair cloak remain their common heritage. The advent of newspapers and the radio indeed actually appear to have increased the Arab's innate appreciation of his own way of life. This is one of the most striking things about Saudi Arabia today. Unlike so many Eastern lands, the Saudi really feel that they are on a basis of equality with everyone else. Ever since the Turks were driven out of the country during the First World War, Arabians have distrusted foreigners and their ways. For this reason, King Abdulaziz ibn Saud had to combat a very natural reluctance on the part of the more conservative elements to welcome people and machines which they did not fully understand. On the other hand, the real nomad of the desert has always been free. Secure in the wilderness of the sands, following desert tracks known only to himself, he has completely escaped that fear of the unknown which haunted settled townsmen. It is from the ranks of the Bedouin, therefore, that come the country's new doctors, air pilots and mechanics. Beyond the British Embassy lie the many-storied mansions of the merchant princes, their delicately carved rosewood lattices ajar to capture any fugitive breeze. Evidence of the invigorating role of oil royalties rises on every side, everywhere. Hawk-eyed Bedouin chiefs drive cars of such modernity that I had not seen their like even in Cairo or Beirut. Here, east meets west, one feels, and the two mingle. Flowing robes may be made of nylon. Ultra-modern automobiles are upholstered in priceless antique carpeting. Running from east to west and north to south, and still triumphantly holding its own, stretches the great collection of open-fronted shops, representing innumerable trades, which is known as the souk, the market which tradition says was there when King Solomon's ships called here on their voyages to the land of Punt, and where the Queen of Sheba's caravans once halted, bringing the ivory of Africa to trade for the perfumes of far Asia. This market is truly oriental, a haphazard, winding, eminently colourful avenue of old-style commerce. It may strike a Western eye as primitive in some ways. Yet you may purchase here not only the finest products of Birmingham and Detroit, but also priceless Eastern wares. I am convinced that there is almost nothing that you cannot buy, examine or order from the world's workshops through the picturesque Jeddah souk. I bought a few things, made friends with some of the multilingual shopkeepers, yarned with them and drank innumerable cups of tea without milk or coffee flavoured with cardamoms. As one intent upon Mecca pictures, however, with my pilgrimage almost upon me, I had to obtain certain data for that vital occasion. I took light readings of the shadows and sunlight at various times of the day, estimated the type of lens that I would need for the job, and thought out different ways to conceal the camera. The technical problems were considerable. How to process the films in that heat without ice? How to conceal the camera and yet be able to sight it? How to overcome the snag that the built-in motor of the apparatus made a terrible click when a picture was taken? If I did not, for instance, develop the films there, how would I know whether I had got suitable results? I took a number of furtive pictures in Jeddah and developed them in my bathroom at the Diafa. The heat was so tremendous that the emulsion cracked and stripped off in the form of jelly. I went to a chemist and asked for formalin or alum to harden the film, but he told me that I would have to have a doctor's prescription. Both are dangerous poisons. There was a photographer's shop in Jeddah, but I did not like to spend too much time there, because pilgrims should not be interesting themselves in cameras. They might have processed the films for me when I got back, but that would mean that the secret would be out. Eventually, I ordered ice and used this. The rumor got around that I was a secret drinker, for alcohol is utterly forbidden in Saudi Arabia, as being against the Islamic faith. In the end, I decided to make my pilgrimage to the shrine and then come back later to take photographs, after examining the possibilities of light and the extent of surveillance exercised. This meant that I was now to confine myself to the duties of the pilgrimage and nothing else. On the Jeddah-Mecca highway, some 3 kilometers out of Jeddah, you will see by the side of the road a massive, futuristic palace. During the day, flags of variegated hue stream from a sort of mast mounted upon the topmost turret. By night, there is an incessant, restless winking of signal lights. If you have hired a car, truck, station wagon, your driver will mutter as he passes this place, "Long live Bar Khashab Pasha and all his children," almost as if it were an invocation. He will stop for a hurried conversation with a very businesslike Arab at the window in the palace wall. Coming home that night, as the twinkling lights come into sight, he will dip his headlights in salute. Day or night, Bar Khashab Pasha's organization is exchanging signals with his fleet of cars. Once Bar Khashab was a humble, ordinary man somewhere on the Saudi coastline, trying to earn a living by hiring out camels. Today, with the enormous expansion of transportation and the demand for vehicles of every kind, the Pasha, nobody knows where he got his title since it is not a Saudi one, has worked his way up until he can loll in luxury, if he were not such a worker. He is small, middle-aged, lithe, laughing and likeable, and when I went to see him, he refused to let me take his photograph, but asked what prospects there were of getting his boy into Eton or Oxford. His case could be multiplied more than 100-fold, throughout almost the length and breadth of Arabia. A new class of Arabs has grown up, the contractor, large farmer, industrialist. Some of the sheikhs and older aristocracy, it is true, have also benefited by the new prosperity. But the two groups never mix, though each has a vital function in the Arabia of today. Go north, to the American oil fields of Dhahran if you want to see action, said Bar Khashab. Those Americans certainly are workers. And why are they successful? Because they have unknowingly applied the principles of Islam, of the Prophet, who said, "I regard myself as a worker." An American to whom I spoke shortly afterwards gave me his version of the question. "John Q. Arab certainly is learning fast. He sure is a worker. The American way of life has gone right in there, deep." So you can take your pick. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. The Arab does not like work without knowing that it will be rewarded. And it must be rewarded, if at all possible, by something really worthwhile. He is, in a sense, a natural capitalist. When the Americans came into the Saudi field, they offered not only substantial royalties in advance of the sinking of even the first well, they supplied a clear hope that not only would the government benefit by a percentage of all oil extracted, but that there would be employment and scope for local enterprise. So the Arabs and Americans could do business. The Americans were, and still are, extremely sensitive about their position in Saudi Arabia. Every one of the 12,000 foreign employees of the Arabian-American company is schooled and drilled and dinned with the principles of the Islamic faith and the subtleties of Arabian custom. No American would think today of venturing anywhere except where the oil company has a right to be. And even then he lives in his robes, his headcloth and rope fillets, like an Arab desert bred. The Americans are in on a good thing. From Dhahran and the surrounding deserts, 1 million barrels of petroleum are extracted daily. Arabian American is sitting, as it was put to me, right on top of the greatest oil field in the world. To have established this bridgehead in the sternly Wahhabite and therefore anti-Christian part of Arabia must be counted as one of the major victories of Western business. It may be said to have been a hard-won victory from the standpoint of pure capitalism, though I am not suggesting that the Americans feel that they have had to give too much. What I can say is that Aramco is an organization in which the winning of the oil from the sands has resulted in a sharing of advantages between Arabs and Americans alike. The Americans have built the Great Mosque, which is the dominating feature of the Saudi oil camp. They have drilled deep water wells in hundreds of places to provide vital sustenance for camels and people. They have their own technical training program for Saudis, hospitals, clinics, shops, agricultural missions, and the rest. While a large number of foreign employees are used in Dhahran, nobody suggests that any foreigner be recruited if there is a Saudi who can do the job. Local contractors have even been set up in business by the company and then patronized by Aramco. While much of the enterprise which has resulted in a new prosperity for the Saudi peninsula is directly attributable to the American spirit and sheer dogged determination, yet the gigantic personality of Abdulaziz ibn al-Saud can conclusively be said to have been the power behind almost everything that has been accomplished during the past 20 years. In order to understand this fully, it will be necessary to make a very brief reference to the position of Arabia in a changing world. According to Arab tradition, mankind's first home was somewhere in the peninsula. Some point to Aden as the site of the Garden of Eden, others to Eve's reputed grave not far out of Jeddah. It is also believed that the Mecca Kaaba was first built by Adam himself on the model of a house of worship in paradise, where the angels endlessly circumambulated, praising their Lord. Further, the Arabs of today claim descent from Abraham through Ishmael, who, they hold, was the son offered by the patriarch to God. Abraham rebuilt the Kaaba and sacred shrine of Arabia, in token of repentance for having cast Hagar out into the wilderness. Hence the sanctity of Hagar's well in the sanctuary, the Zamzam, believed to be the same stream which God caused to spring miraculously for Hagar's succor. It is, of course, known that the Arabs and Jews are both of Semitic origin, and that their languages are derived from a similar root. Hence there is some likelihood on the face of it that in pre-recorded times the Arabs followed the Hebrew religious dispensation. While the Jews, however, maintained to a greater or lesser degree their monotheism, the Arabs, in the tribal wandering throughout the great deserts, lapsed into a theology which was based upon a number of gods. These took two forms. The main deities represented the sun, moon, and planets, while the lesser ones were totems which watched over individual tribes. The sanctity of Mecca remained in their observances, and the sanctuary, Haram, became the home of over 300 idols. The rites of pilgrimage, adapted to the worship of the gods, continued uninterruptedly. This was the period of the Jahiliyyah, the days of ignorance, which existed until the 7th century of the Christian era, when Muhammad preached a return to monotheism. Muhammad was, as is fairly well known, a member of the most noble clan of the Arabs, the Quraysh, who were shrine keepers at the Haram. It was in Mecca that the first chapters of the Quran, literally the recitation, were revealed to Muhammad, as Muslims believe, by the Archangel Gabriel. According to this mandate, Muhammad was commanded by God to lead the people out of ignorance, to make them worship one God alone, and to follow the code of morality and law which, Islam says, has been carried out through successive prophets. Islam, which means submission to the will of God, is therefore not a new religion. According to the Quran, it is the modern manifestation of the preaching of such people as Moses and Jesus. Islam therefore recognizes the Jewish dispensation, as does Christianity, but accepts Jesus, whom the Jews do not, on the restricted basis of his being a divinely inspired man and not a divine being. All this has definite bearing upon Arabian and world history subsequent to Muhammad's mission. After the persecutions and trials common to all great religious teachers, Muhammad found that his preaching had eventually converted almost all Arabia. But Islam was for the whole world. This is a fundamental. So it must be spread. When he died, Muhammad had just completed his exchange of letters with neighboring rulers, calling upon them to accept Islam. Under Muhammad's immediate successors, the Arab tribes, unified for the first time in history, poured forth from the deserts and conquered all North Africa to the Atlantic, all the Holy Roman Empire, and what is now Turkey, Persia, and Afghanistan. Under successive dynasties, Islam became the most powerful force on earth. Muslims reached the borders of France and Austria, pushed far into China, overcame all India, marched into the Russian steppes. For several hundred years, the Islamic centers of learning retrieved and developed lost sciences and became the magnet for seekers after knowledge everywhere. Islam had by now become a composite civilization, as well as a religion and social order. With the entry of the Persian, Indian, and European elements, a synthesis had been produced. Then came the destruction of the military and cultural force of the new world state. The eruption of the pagan Mongol hordes from Central Asia literally ground the Muslims into a mire of their own blood, and the ruins of their cities, farms, universities. From this blow, Islam has never really recovered. True, the Mongols eventually accepted Islam, but so much had been lost that it has taken nearly 1,000 years to revive. Saudi Arabia became subject to Ottoman Turkey. Deep in their desert strongholds, the Bedouin were little affected by what went on in the world. But they nursed their heritage, the possession of the Quran, and the knowledge that it had been under Arabs and Muslims that their power had extended from Spain to China. The Turks were driven out of Arabia by an alliance between Bedouins, Hijazi Arabs, and the British, in which rebellion the late T.E. Lawrence played such a part. But the northern area, home of the Wahhabites, had never really been under effective Turkish control. Even before the First World War, the Saudis, the family of Ibn Saud, were working and fighting to regain control of Najd, their former homeland. By 1902, the 20-year-old Abdulaziz ibn al-Saud had captured the northern fortress of Riyadh. The descendants of the Prophet, who were nominal rulers of Mecca in the south, and who cooperated with the British to throw off the Turkish yoke, had to leave and set up their own small kingdoms in Iraq and Transjordan. Saud made himself master of the Peninsula Arabia. The first period of his reorganization of the country pacified the tribes under the banner of Saud the Great. Then the effete south was visited with severe punishment, and all extravagances were put down. Domes and minarets were levelled, for example, as being importations foreign to the simple spirit of Islam. But Ibn Saud could not go any further with his big plans for the development and uplift of the 7 million Arabs without more money than any Arab could conceive of at that time. For nearly 20 years, Saudi Arabia depended solely upon customs dues and the few £1 million that the pilgrims brought each year for their expenses. Then, in 1933, King Abdulaziz arranged with American companies to drill for oil. I was told by one veteran of those days that the geologists were convinced that somewhere here, in the wild and hostile Wahhabi country, lay the world's largest deposit. And it took them 5 years of wildcat or random drilling to locate it. After they did, Saudi Arabia never had to look back. Arabia had become front-page news. In the days just before the Second World War, Germans, Italians, and even the Japanese fought for oil and commercial concessions. Britain and America were reported to be at loggerheads because, it was said, Britain thought that she should have a greater interest in the oil. Ibn Saud weathered it all. During the last war, he was one of the few neutral statesmen who consistently supported the Allied cause. When Vichy held Syria in an uneasy pro-Axis grip, and Rashid Ali el-Gailani revolted in Iraq, all seemed lost to the United Nations. Ibn Saud, as I was told in Riyadh, could easily have thrown in his lot with the Germans and would have had little to lose. Deprived of his oil, the British and American fleets and mercantile marine would have been crippled in this part of the world. The Japanese could have made liaison with the Germans via the Arabian coastline, and the route between India and Europe made completely impossible. Persia would have been outflanked. Even if the Germans had won the war, the Arabs believe that such is the value of the oil fields at Dhahran and elsewhere in Nejd, they could have negotiated a peace based upon the security of the wells. For no matter how strong the Americans may be in this area, not one drop of oil can be pumped without active Arab friendship. This cooperation could come only through the Saudi regime, but Saud had given his word. This ultra-rapid survey of Arabian history has only noted the highlights. Ibn Saud's own life story, for instance, is one of the world's classic accounts of one man battling against odds which, as you read it, seem almost insane. Equally, the fact that the Saudi royal family is now fabulously wealthy does not mean that they have waxed rich on oil at everyone else's expense. The very contrary is the case. Visualize the position of Saudi Arabia in 1938, when the first royalties were coming in. Here was a country just about as underprivileged as any in the world. There were no roads, almost no electric light, no aircraft, factories, industries, banking, insurance, public security, national currency, hygiene, drainage. There was one newspaper and no radio station. Education was carried on by aged and often blind clerics, teaching small boys the Quran by heart. There were no building materials except mud and a little wood. Where would you start? There was only one way to do it. Ibn Saud bought the lot himself. He surrounded himself with all the talent that came his way. Most of the men are still with him today, and I had the privilege of meeting them. There was Sheikh Abdullah al-Fadl, the financial brain, Sheikh Hafiz Wahba, the shrewd diplomat and Egyptian, Sheikh Abdullah Suleiman from the north in charge of economic affairs, and Fuad Bey Hamza, the Syrian, who carried the country through many a crisis. Saud, in advising Rashid Ali against military action aimed at Britain, is on record as having said, "I am a staunch friend of Great Britain, inheriting this friendship from my grandfather, Faisal ibn Turki. When a friend is under duress, then for the sake of friendship one does not act against him. Personally, if I had sufficient armaments, I would have gone to the help of Great Britain and not acted against her. With the exception of the question of Palestine, Great Britain did nothing against Arab interests, and the present war is one of life and death. So our duty is, if unable to help Britain, to be neutral. This is the least that I can do." Although King Ibn Saud declared war on Germany and Japan eventually, he did not allow this to affect in the least the age-old code of Arab and Muslim hospitality. Those Arabs who had supported the Axis powers during the Second World War and fled to him for asylum were unconditionally granted protection. When I returned to Jeddah from Riyadh after seeing the king, I was told, off the record, of something that had taken place just before I saw His Majesty. Someone had got the idea that I was a spy of some sort, and this rumour had reached the king's ears. Ibn Saud thundered at his informant, "This is our guest. If he is a spy, let him spy. He will not be able to combat the strength of our faith, which is the most powerful thing that we have. And if he is not a spy, as I believe he is not, then Allah will punish you with all his power, for there is no mercy for intriguers." But I did not know of the whispers which had preceded me to the court, and continued my preparations to journey Meccawards, to the shrine of the Black Stone. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.